The salvage ship moved through the darkness like a small fish in an endless ocean. Captain stood on the bridge, watching the massive shape grow larger on her screens. She had seen many dead ships in her 15 years of salvage work, but nothing like this. The derelict was huge. It stretched for almost 3 kilometers, twisting and curving in ways that made her eyes hurt. The hull looked organic, like bone or shell, but it shimmered with crystal formations that caught the distant starlight. Parts of it seemed to pulse, even though all their scans said the ship was dead. "That's not possible," said from the engineering station. He was staring at his readings with a confused expression. "Captain, this thing has been floating here for thousands of years, maybe longer, but there's still power inside." Walked over to look at his screen. The power readings were faint but steady, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. "Can you identify the source?" Shook his head. "Nothing in our database matches it. It's not fusion, not antimatter, not even dark matter conversion. It's something else entirely." Minu, her security officer, checked his weapon systems from habit. Could it be dangerous? "Everything unknown is dangerous," replied. She looked at the fourth member of her crew. "What do you think?" The was young but brilliant. She had joined the crew 6 months ago, fresh from university with degrees that barely understood, studied the derelict with wide eyes. "The architecture matches architect designs," said quietly. "The architects were the precursor race. They disappeared millions of years ago, but their technology is still the most advanced ever discovered. If this is really one of their ships, it could change everything we know about them." Made her decision. "We're going in, prepare the boarding pod. Mean you full gear, bring your analysis equipment." They suited up and crossed to the derelict. The airlock they found was overgrown with crystalline structures, but it still responded to electromagnetic pulse. The door opened with a sound like breathing. Inside, the ship was like walking through a living thing. The corridors had ribbed walls that looked like the inside of a throat. Bioluminescent patches on the ceiling gave off soft blue light. The floor was smooth but slightly flexible under their boots. "This is incredible," whispered. She ran her gloved hand along the wall. "The entire ship is a hybrid of biological and mechanical systems. The architects didn't just build technology, they grew it." They moved deeper into the ship, following the power readings. The corridors twisted and turned, always sloping downward. After 20 minutes they found it. The chamber was enormous. It was spherical, with walls covered in the same bioluminescent patterns. But the center of the room held something that made them all stop and stare. It was a door, but unlike any door had ever seen. It was 10 meters tall and perfectly circular. The surface was covered in what looked like living tissue, pulsing with light in complex patterns. Crystalline structures grew from it like veins, spreading across the walls. In the center was a panel with thousands of small indentations, each one slightly different. A biolock breathed. "This is a biolock. I've read about them but never seen one." Was already scanning it. The lock is connected to the entire ship's power grid. Whatever is behind that door, the architects wanted it protected. Approached the lock carefully. The pulsing patterns seemed to respond to her presence, growing brighter. "Can we open it?" "Not with anything we have," said. "This isn't a mechanical lock or a computer system. It's alive. It's waiting for something specific." They spent hours studying the lock, taking readings and samples. Discovered that the patterns on its surface weren't random. They were a language, but not one she recognized from any architect's site. When they returned to their ship, sent out a report. She knew what would happen next. A discovery like this couldn't be kept quiet. The galactic powers arrived within 2 days. First came in their massive hive ships. They looked like insects but were far more intelligent. They thought in pure logic and mathematics. Their ships filled the space around the derelict like a swarm. They came next. They were beings of pure energy, living in containment suits shaped like elegant statues. They spoke in harmonics that had to be translated by computers. Their vessels glowed with internal light. Last came the Thane Empire. The Thane were large reptilian beings with scales that changed color with their moods. They were warriors and strategists, respected and feared across the galaxy. Their fleet was small but heavily armed. Within a week, the derelict was surrounded by a makeshift station. Hundreds of scientists, soldiers, and diplomats from 3 different species, all working toward the same goal: opening that door. And her crew were pushed aside. They had found the derelict, but they were just humans. Humans were the species in the galactic community, barely 200 years since first contact. They were considered primitive by the older races. Didn't mind. She watched from her ship as the best minds in the galaxy attempted to crack the biolock. They went first. They brought quantum computers that could calculate every possible combination in seconds. They tried millions of different patterns on the lock's surface. The biolock didn't respond at all. It just kept pulsing with its steady rhythm. They tried next. They believed the lock responded to energy patterns. They projected harmonics, light frequencies, and quantum states at it. The lock remained closed. The Thane used biological approaches. They had cloned tissue samples from the lock and created interfaces that matched its genetic structure. They tried to communicate with it as if it were a living creature. Nothing worked. Weeks turned into months. Frustration grew. The 3 powers began to argue. They accused each other of sabotage. Small fights broke out between security forces. The station became tense and dangerous. spent her time watching and learning. She noticed something the others missed. The biolock never rejected the attempts. It didn't push back or show signs of defense. It simply waited as if none of them were giving it what it wanted. Late at night, when the station was quiet, would go to the chamber alone. She would sit in front of the massive door and watch the pattern's pulse. Sometimes she felt like the lock was watching her back. She began to dream about the ship. In her dreams, the corridors were full of light and life. Beings she had never seen walked through them, touching the walls with affection. In the dreams, she could walk through the sealed door as if it wasn't there. She told no one about the dreams. In the galactic community, humans were already considered emotional and unstable. Reporting dreams would get her removed from the mission. But the dreams continued, growing stronger each night. And the biolock kept pulsing, waiting for something only it understood. 3 months had passed since the galactic powers arrived. The station around the derelict had grown into a small city in space. Hundreds of the galaxy's best scientists worked day and night on the biolock problem. The door remained sealed. Walked through the research section, invisible among the crowds of alien researchers. Being human meant being overlooked. The other species barely noticed her as she moved between their workstations. They had built an entire laboratory dedicated to quantum analysis. Their lead scientist, a being whose name translated to Calculation Prime, had spent weeks running simulations. Watched as it directed its drones to test another pattern on the lock. The biolock pulsed once, then returned to its normal rhythm. Another failure. This is impossible, Calculation Prime clicked in frustration. We have tested every mathematical sequence known to science. The lock responds to none of them. Moved on to the section. Here, the air hummed with energy fields. The scientists floated in their containment suits, projecting complex light patterns at holographic models of the lock. The lock possesses consciousness, one of the scientists harmonized. But it is a consciousness we cannot comprehend. Our attempts at communication fail because we have no common reference. The Thane section was different. They had built what looked like an operating room. Samples of the lock's tissue grew in vats, pulsing with the same bioluminescent patterns. Thane bioengineers studied the samples with intense focus. The tissue is still alive after millions of years. One of them explained to a colleague. It maintains itself through some kind of quantum biological process. But when we try to interface with it, our signals are simply ignored. Found in the human section, which was much smaller than the others. Her friend looked tired. She had been working non-stop on translating the inscriptions found throughout the ship. "I found something," said without looking up from her microscope. "Come see this." Looked through the viewer. At high magnification, The ship's walls were covered in tiny markings. They were so small that regular scans had missed them completely. "These aren't instructions," explained. "They're stories. Millions and millions of stories carved into the molecular structure of the ship itself. Birth stories, death stories, love stories, war stories. Every surface is covered with them." "What kind of species writes stories into their ships?" asked. "A species that values memory above everything else," replied. She pulled up another sample. "Look at this pattern. It's a memory of someone's childhood. And this one is a memory of a great battle. The architects didn't just build this ship. They encoded their entire cultural memory into it." Felt something click in her mind. Memory. The lock isn't waiting for a code. It's waiting for someone who understands memory. Nodded slowly. "Maybe, but whose memory? What kind of memory would open it?" Before could answer. Alarms blared throughout the station. She ran to the command center with close behind. Was at a monitoring station, his face pale. "The ship's biological systems are failing. The power readings have dropped by 15% in the last hour." On the main screen, they could see the biolock. Its pulsing patterns were slower, dimmer. The bioluminescent patches throughout the ship were fading. A Thane commander stepped forward. "How long until complete system failure?" Checked his calculations. "At this rate, maybe 6 months. Whatever has kept this ship alive for millions of years is finally dying." The room erupted in angry voices. The demanded immediate action. The suggested cutting through the hull around the door. The Thane proposed destroying the lock entirely and forcing entry. "That would destroy everything inside," protested. "The knowledge would be lost forever." "Better lost than claimed by our enemies," a Thane general growled, his scales flashing red with anger. The three powers began arguing among themselves. Accusations flew. The claimed the Thane had sabotaged the lock. The accused the of hiding discoveries. The Thane threatened to take the ship by force. Security forces on all sides moved to combat readiness. The station trembled with the possibility of war. Slipped away during the chaos. She made her way back to the derelict, to the chamber with the biolock. Minyu tried to follow her, but she ordered him to stay behind. She stood alone in front of the massive door. The patterns pulsed weakly now, like a dying heartbeat. She placed her hand on the warm surface. "What are you waiting for?" she whispered. "What do you need?" The dreams had been getting stronger. Last night she had seen the architects themselves. They were tall and graceful, with bodies that seemed to shift between solid and energy. They had touched their ship with love, speaking to it in a language that wasn't words. In the dream, one of them had looked directly at her. It had reached out, and for a moment she felt what it felt. The joy of discovery, the pain of loss, the weight of carrying memories too heavy to bear alone. She pressed both hands against the lock now. "I don't understand you," she said, "but I'm trying to. Show me what you need." The lock pulsed brighter for just a moment, felt something respond inside her mind. Not words or images, but feelings, loneliness, hope, waiting, an endless, patient waiting for someone who could understand. Footsteps echoed behind her, entered the chamber carrying a data pad. "I finished translating a section from near the lock," said. "I think I know what the architects wanted." She showed the translation. It was a story about a child who had died young. The parents had carved the memory of their child into this ship so that the child would never be forgotten. Nearby was another memory of an artist who had created something beautiful that lasted only a moment. Another memory of a war that taught a terrible lesson. "The ship is a memorial," said quietly. "Not just technology. The architects put their hearts into it, all their joys and sorrows preserved forever." Understood then. The lock wasn't testing for intelligence or power. It was testing for something else entirely, something the with their logic couldn't provide, something the with their energy couldn't give, something the Thane with their genetic memory couldn't access. It was testing for empathy, for the ability to carry another being's pain and joy, for the uniquely mortal understanding that some things must be remembered, even when remembering hurts. "The other species," said slowly. "They're trying to crack a code, but there is no code." "What do you mean?" Looked at the lock with new understanding. The think in pure logic. The are energy beings who never die. The Thane have genetic memory that's collective and instinctual. But humans, she paused, we carry our dead with us. We tell stories about people who are gone. We remember things that hurt us because forgetting would be worse. His eyes widened. "You think the lock is waiting for someone who understands grief?" "Not just grief, memory. Real, personal, painful, beautiful memory. The kind that changes you." Outside the chamber they could hear shouting. The three powers were still arguing, their patience finally exhausted. Soon they would take action. The lock would be destroyed, and whatever the architects had preserved would be lost. Made her decision. "I'm going to try to open it." "How?" "I'm going to give it what it wants, a memory that matters." She placed both hands on the lock and closed her eyes. This time, she didn't try to solve it or crack it. She just remembered. She remembered her father, who had died when she was 12. She remembered his laugh and the way he had taught her about stars. She remembered the pain of losing him and the joy of having known him. The biolock began to glow. The moment's memory touched the biolock. Everything changed. The pulsing patterns exploded with light, racing across the surface like lightning through clouds. The entire chamber filled with brilliant bioluminescence. gasped as the connection deepened. It wasn't painful, but it was overwhelming. She felt the lock reaching into her mind, not taking but sharing. And suddenly she wasn't standing in the chamber anymore. She was somewhere else entirely. The ship was alive. Corridors blazed with light and movement. The architects walked through their creation with grace and purpose, saw them clearly now, not as aliens but as people. They were tall, with bodies that seemed to shift between states of matter, sometimes solid, sometimes translucent, always beautiful. But there was something wrong with them. As watched, she realized they were all doing the same things over and over, the same conversations, the same gestures, like actors in a play that never ended. She moved through their world like a ghost. None of them could see her. She watched as they lived their perfect, unchanging lives. No one aged. No one grew sick. No one died. And no one changed. A memory rose up around her, sharp and clear. She was seeing through the eyes of an architect named, stood in a garden that grew inside the ship. The plants here were engineered to never die, never wilt, never change. Perfect flowers that would bloom forever. Hated them. I remember when flowers died, thought, and felt the thought as if it were her own. I remember the sadness of watching petals fall. I remember learning to love them more because they didn't last. Now they bloom forever, and I feel nothing when I look at them. The memory shifted. Saw the moment the architects achieved immortality. They had transferred their consciousness into their technology, merging biology and machine. They had encoded their minds into quantum states that would persist for millions of years. They had defeated death itself. The celebration had lasted for decades. But slowly, terribly, they began to understand what they had lost. Without death, there was no urgency. Without change, there was no growth. Without loss, there was no meaning. They had become living recordings of who they once were, endlessly playing back the same thoughts and feelings. An artist named tried to create something new, but every piece made was just a variation of old ideas. There was nothing truly new left inside. The wells of inspiration had run dry, and nothing could refill them. A philosopher named Sem wrote a treatise that spread through the entire architect civilization. We sought to preserve life, and instead we have preserved only existence. We are no longer alive. We are memories of living beings, playing on repeat for eternity. The despair that followed was quiet and absolute. The architects couldn't die, but they could stop pretending they were alive. They stopped creating. They stopped growing. They became caretakers of their own vast, empty immortality. Felt their loneliness like a physical weight. Millions of years of existing without living, of remembering joy without being able to feel new joy, of having infinite time but nothing new to fill it with. Then came their final decision. She watched as the architects gathered in vast assemblies across their worlds. They had debated for centuries, but the conclusion was inevitable. They would encode themselves one last time, not into living bodies, but into their ships and cities and monuments. They would become guardians of knowledge, waiting for someone else to find them, someone who was still alive in the way they had once been alive, someone who still grew and changed and died. "We will wait," Sem had said in the final gathering. "Somewhere in this vast universe, there must be species who still live with death, who still create because they know their time is limited, who still feel urgency and passion and fear. We will leave our knowledge for them, but only if they can understand why we failed." The biolock was their test, not a test of intelligence or power, but a test of understanding. Could a species comprehend what the architects had learned too late? Could they value mortality enough to deserve immortal knowledge? Watched as Sem and millions of others dissolved into their creations. They spread their consciousness through the molecular structure of their ships, encoding not just data but their actual lived experiences. Every joy, every sorrow, every mistake. The biolock was the last thing they created. It would only open for beings who carried their own mortality with them. Beings who understood that some things were precious because they didn't last forever. The vision began to break apart, felt herself being pulled back to her own body, her own time. But before she left completely, she felt reach out to her across millions of years. "Thank you," thought whispered. "Thank you for still being alive." Slammed back into her body with a scream. She was still standing with her hands on the biolock, but now the entire chamber was filled with blinding light. The patterns on the lock had gone wild, spreading across every surface. Was shouting something but couldn't hear her. The lock was opening. The massive circular door was splitting apart, sections folding back like a flower blooming. But something was wrong. Hands were fused to the lock's surface. She could feel her neural patterns sinking too deeply with the ancient consciousness. Her own memories were bleeding into the lock, and the lock's memories were flooding into her. She saw her father again, but this time mixed with memories of losing loved ones. She felt her own fear of death tangled with desperate wish to die. Her hope for the future merged with Sem's ancient despair. Minyu burst into the chamber with behind him. He grabbed shoulders, trying to pull her away from the lock. "Don't," screamed. Breaking the connection now could kill her. "It's killing her anyway," Minyu shouted back. Was frantically scanning the lock. Her neural patterns are synchronizing with the ship's biosystem. If this continues, she'll become part of it. She won't be able to separate herself. Through the pain and confusion, felt the lock respond to their fear. It didn't want to hurt her. The architects had never meant to harm anyone. but the connection had grown too deep, too fast. She had opened something that had been sealed for millions of years, and the release was overwhelming both of them. Behind the opening door, she could see what lay beyond. A vast chamber filled with crystalline structures that pulsed with the same bioluminescent patterns. Each crystal was a node in a massive network, a repository of consciousness and knowledge that stretched back eons. The complete history of the architect civilization was there. Every discovery, every art piece, every philosophical breakthrough. Technology that could remake the galaxy. Understanding that could elevate any species to godhood. And the terrible warning. This knowledge had destroyed the species that created it. The door was fully open now. The three galactic powers would arrive at any moment. They would rush in, claim the knowledge, and repeat the architect's mistake. They would seek immortality and lose themselves in the process. Unless could find a way to control the lock, to set conditions on who could access the repository. But she was drowning in memories that weren't hers. She was losing the boundary between herself and the ancient consciousness of the ship. In moments, she wouldn't be any more. She would be another ghost, another recording playing on repeat. Captain's voice cut through the chaos. You need to stay with us. Remember who you are. Tried to focus. Who was she? The memories swirled and mixed. Was she mourning the death of change? Was she desperate to create something new? Was she Sem, watching an entire civilization lose its soul? No, she was human, mortal, still alive. She held onto that thought like a lifeline. She was still alive, and that meant she could still change. She could still make choices that mattered. She could still die, which meant her life still had meaning. The lock responded to her certainty. The wild patterns began to calm, organizing themselves into something more controlled. Felt her own consciousness separate from the architect's, creating a boundary. She was still connected, but no longer drowning. She could feel the lock now, understand it, control it. And that meant she could decide what happened next. The first thing felt when she separated from the drowning consciousness was pain. Her hands burned where they touched the biolock. Her head pounded with the weight of alien memories. But she was herself again, and that was enough. Captain, your vitals are stabilizing, reported, relief flooding his voice. The chamber was still filled with light, but it was calmer now. The biolock had stopped its wild pulsing. The door stood fully open, revealing the crystalline repository beyond, and remained connected to the lock, able to feel its consciousness like a second heartbeat beneath her own. Heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor. The galactic powers had detected the door opening. They were coming. They arrived first, their forms moving with mechanical precision. Calculation Prime led them, flanked by armed drones. Behind came their energy forms blazing with excitement. The Thane brought up the rear, their scales shifting through aggressive reds and oranges. They all stopped when they saw still connected to the lock. The human has opened the door, Calculation Prime clicked in surprise. How is this possible? A Thane general stepped forward, his massive form intimidating even in the spacious chamber. It doesn't matter how. Step aside, human. This knowledge belongs to those who can properly use it. Didn't move. Through her connection to the lock, she could feel the entire ship responding to her will. The architects had built one final safeguard. Whoever opened the door controlled access to what lay beyond. "I've seen what's in there," said quietly. "I've lived through the memories of the beings who created it. And I'm telling you, this knowledge isn't what you think it is." "We didn't come here for philosophy," the Thane general growled. "We came for technology." Looked at each of the species representatives in turn. The architects achieved immortality. They encoded their consciousness into quantum states that would last forever. They defeated death itself. The brightened with interest. They, being energy beings, already lived for thousands of years. True immortality would make them eternal. And it destroyed them, continued. They became unable to create, unable to change, unable to grow. They existed for millions of years but stopped living. This repository is their warning as much as their gift. Calculation Prime's drones scan the open chamber. We detect no weapons, no traps, only data storage. Your warnings are meaningless, human. They're not meaningless. Stepped forward, her data pad displaying the translations she had made. The architects wrote their story into every molecule of this ship. They want you to understand what happened to them before you take their knowledge. A scientist floated closer. "We are not the architects. We will not repeat their mistakes." "That's what they thought too," replied. She could feel the ship's memories, still accessible through her connection to the lock. They believed they were wise enough to handle immortality. They were wrong. The Thane general's patience broke. "Enough talk. My species has waited too long for this opportunity. If you won't move aside, we'll move you." His soldiers raised their weapons. The drones activated their cutting tools. They began to gather energy for a pulse that would knock unconscious. Felt the biolock respond to the threat. The ship's defensive systems came online, systems that had slept for millions of years. The walls began to pulse with a different kind of light, sharp and warning. "Wait," Minu stepped between and the armed forces. "Attacking her won't help. She's connected to the ship's systems. You hurt her, the ship might seal itself forever." Calculation Prime calculated rapidly. The human speaks truth. The biolock remains open because she maintains the connection. Severing it could reverse the door mechanism. The Thane general lowered his weapon, but his scales remained angry red. "Then what do you propose, human?" Took a deep breath. Through the lock, she could feel the vast repository of knowledge waiting beyond the door. The architects had left it all: medical technology that could cure any disease, engineering principles that could reshape planets, philosophical insights that could transform civilizations. But she had also felt their warning. She had experienced their regret. She understood what they wanted. "I'll give you access," said, "but with one condition." "Humans don't make conditions with their betters," the Thane general snapped. A elder pulsed gentle light. "Peace, General. Let us hear what she proposes. We have waited this long, we can wait a few moments more." Gathered her thoughts. "Each of your species can send one representative into the repository, but they must experience what I experienced. They must live through the architect's memories, feel their rise and their fall, understand what immortality cost them." "Why?" Calculation Prime asked. "Because the architects don't want their knowledge used blindly. They want you to understand the price of what you're seeking. If, after experiencing their memories, you still want to proceed, the knowledge is yours." The three powers conferred among themselves, waited, feeling the ship pulse around her like a living heart. She could sense the architect's consciousness, still present in the crystalline matrix. They were watching, hoping that the younger species would learn from their mistakes. The decided first. "We refuse," Calculation Prime declared. "Emotional experiences are irrelevant to logical analysis. We will take the technology and apply it correctly through pure reason." Calculation Prime moved toward the door. The biolock responded instantly, sending a pulse of energy that gently but firmly pushed the leader back. Not harmful, but absolute. "The lock refuses you," said. "You can't force your way in. The architects built it to resist exactly that." They tried twice more, using different approaches. Each time the ship's biological defenses activated, blocking them without causing harm. Finally, Calculation Prime and the other retreated, clicking in frustration. "This is illogical," Calculation Prime protested. "The knowledge should be available to all." "The architects disagree," replied. "They only want to share with those willing to understand." The conferred in harmonic patterns too complex for the translators. Finally, their eldest representative floated forward. "We accept your condition, Captain. I will undergo the experience." Guided to the biolock. She showed the energy being how to make contact, how to open themselves to the memories. The merged with the lock's consciousness and went still. For 3 hours they remained motionless. When they finally separated from the lock, their energy field had changed. The usual bright, confident glow was dimmed, thoughtful. "What did you see?" the other asked eagerly. The elder was silent for a long moment. Then, in harmonics that rang with profound sadness, they said, "I saw the end of joy. I saw existence without purpose. I saw eternity as a cage." "And what is your decision?" asked gently. "We withdraw our claim to this knowledge," the elder declared. "We have already lived for thousands of years. To seek millions more would be to repeat the architect's error. We will return to our space and consider what we have learned." The other protested, but the elder was firm. Within the hour, the fleet had departed, leaving behind only questions and wonder. The Thane watched all this with calculating eyes. Their general stepped forward. "Our species has always valued strength and conquest," he said, "but we also value wisdom. I will undergo your test, human." The Thane general approached the biolock. His massive hands touched the surface with surprising gentleness. The connection formed, and watched as the warrior's expression shifted through emotions she had never seen on a Thane face before. When he emerged 6 hours later, tears rolled down his scaled cheeks. Had never seen a Thane cry. She didn't know they could. "I saw them build paradise," the general said hoarsely. "And I watched paradise become a tomb. They had everything except the one thing that matters. They could no longer die for something meaningful." He turned to face his own people. "We came here seeking power to dominate the galaxy. But I have learned that some power comes at too high a cost. We will take only the medical knowledge, the healing technology. We will leave the rest untouched." Felt relief flood through her. 2 of the 3 powers had understood. They had seen the warning and heeded it. But the remained, clicking in agitation and anger. And they would not accept defeat so easily. The Thane fleet departed peacefully, their ships carrying only the medical knowledge they had requested. Watched them go and felt a small hope kindle in her chest. Maybe the galaxy could learn from the architect's mistakes after all. But the remained, and they were not peaceful. Calculation Prime gathered the forces in the station's command center. Through her connection to the ship, could feel their frustration building like pressure in a sealed container. "This is unacceptable," Calculation Prime declared to the assembled drones and scientists. "One human should not control access to the greatest knowledge in the galaxy. Logic demands we find a solution." Monitored the communications and relayed them to "Captain, they're planning something. Their weapons systems are powering up." Minu checked his own security feeds. "They're positioning ships around the derelict. If they can't get in through the door, they might try to cut through the hull and bypass the lock entirely." Felt the ship respond to the threat. The architects had built defenses into their creation, systems designed to protect the repository from exactly this kind of assault. But those defenses hadn't been used in millions of years. She wasn't sure they would work. "Can we evacuate?" asked. Shook her head. I'm still connected to the biolock. If I leave, the door will seal again. Everything we've accomplished will be lost. Then we convince them to stand down, Minyu said, reaching for his weapons. You can't convince beings who think in pure logic, pointed out. To them, emotional arguments are meaningless. Closed her eyes and focused on her connection to the ship. Through the biolock, she could feel the entire derelict like an extension of her own body. The crystalline repository pulsed with stored consciousness. The corridors thrummed with ancient power, and deep in the ship's core something else stirred. The architects weren't completely gone. Fragments of their consciousness remained, woven into the ship's systems. They had been watching, waiting, hopping. Now they reached out with a question that wasn't words but pure meaning. What will you do? Before she could answer, they attacked. Cutting beams lanced out from their ships, slicing into the derelict's hull. The ship's defenses activated immediately, sending pulses of electromagnetic energy that disabled the beams. But they adapted quickly, adjusting their frequencies and attacking from new angles. They're trying to cut a path directly to the repository, reported. They'll bypass the biolock entirely. Felt the ship's pain as the beams cut into it. The living tissue of the hull tried to heal, but the damage was coming too fast. In minutes, the would breach through to the crystalline chamber. Through her connection, sensed what the ship could do. It had weapons, ancient and terrible. It could destroy the fleet with a thought. The architects had built their ships to defend themselves, and those defenses had once conquered galaxies. But using those weapons would make her no better than It would prove that violence was the answer to disagreement. It would dishonor everything the architects had learned. There had to be another way. Reached deeper into the ship's consciousness, past the defensive systems, past the repository of knowledge, into the very heart of what the architects had been. She found their final gift, the thing they had encoded into every system: choice. The architects had learned too late that immortality without choice was a prison. They had built their final creation to ensure that choice remained possible. The ship, the lock, the repository, all of it was designed to give other species the choice they themselves had lost. Made her choice. Ship, she said aloud, knowing it could hear her through the connection. Close the door, seal the repository. Gasped, what are you doing? Giving them what the architects wanted them to have, the choice to walk away. The massive circular door began to close. Seeing this intensified their attack. Their cutting beams burned brighter, digging deeper into the hull. But wasn't finished. Through the biolock, she sent a message to every ship in the area. Not words, but a transmission of pure experience. She shared what she had felt in the architect's memories. The joy of discovery turning to dust, the horror of endless existence without purpose, the desperate wish for death that would never come. She forced them to feel it, if only for a moment. The cutting beam stopped. In the command center of the flagship, Calculation Prime stood motionless. For the first time in its existence, it had felt something beyond logic. It had touched emotion, however briefly, and the experience had shocked its systems. Impossible, Calculation Prime clicked weakly. Logic does not account for such suffering. The other drones buzzed in confusion. Their entire worldview was based on pure reason. But what had shown them reason? The architects had made the logical choice to achieve immortality, and it had destroyed them more thoroughly than any war. Calculation Prime processed this for several minutes. Finally, it sent a communication to. We do not understand what we felt, but we recognize that we do not understand. This is new. I smiled tiredly. That's the first step toward wisdom. We withdraw, Calculation Prime declared. This knowledge is not for beings of pure logic. We see that now. The fleet departed, leaving behind only the fading trails of their engines. The station fell silent. The derelict floated in space, damaged but intact, its secret still sealed behind the closed door. Finally separated her hands from the biolock. The connection broke gently this time, leaving her exhausted but whole. She stumbled, and Minyu caught her before she fell. It's over, she said. They're all gone. What happens now? Asked, looking at the sealed door. Felt the ship's consciousness one last time, a faint pulse of gratitude and something that might have been relief. The architects had waited millions of years for someone to understand them. Now, finally, they could rest. Now we make sure their warning isn't forgotten, said. She turned to her crew. We establish this ship as a neutral archive. Anyone who wants to access it must go through what I went through. They must understand the cost before they claim the prize. Over the following months, they set up the library of what was lost, became its first keeper, dedicated to translating the architect's stories and sharing their wisdom, worked as the guardian engineer, maintaining the ship's ancient systems with reverence and care. Minyu served as chief of security, ensuring that only those truly seeking understanding could approach. Word spread through the galaxy. Some species came seeking easy power and left disappointed or changed. Others approached with humility and received exactly the knowledge they needed. A few, seeing what the architects had become, chose to celebrate their own mortality rather than seek to escape it. The Thane Empire used their medical knowledge to heal old wounds between species. An alliance formed, built on the shared understanding that some things were more valuable than power. They began to voluntarily limit their own, choosing to die after a few thousand years so that new could be born with fresh perspectives. Even the changed, slowly and carefully integrating emotional understanding into their logical frameworks. It made them less efficient but more wise. Remained as the administrator of the library for 10 years. She ensured that the architect's warning reached every corner of the galaxy. Then, tired and satisfied, she retired to Earth. She grew old there, watching her play under blue skies. She told them stories about the ship and the beings who had built it. She taught them that life was precious because it ended, and that some gifts were too dangerous to accept. On her deathbed, surrounded by family, felt one final pulse from across the light years. The biolock, responding to her fading consciousness, sent a message of gratitude. The architects, those ancient ghosts, thanked her for understanding what they had learned too late. She smiled and closed her eyes for the last time, content in her mortality. The biolock sealed itself permanently after her death, its purpose fulfilled. But the library remained open, and with it, the story of the architects and the human who had learned their lesson. In the end, humanity's gift to the galaxy wasn't strength or intelligence or advanced technology. It was the wisdom to know when to reach for power and when to walk away. It was the understanding that mortality gave meaning to existence, and that some things should remain sealed not because they were too dangerous, but because they were too sad. The architects had achieved immortality and lost everything that made life worth living. Humanity, young and mortal and gloriously finite, had shown the galaxy a different path. Not eternal life, but meaningful life. Not endless existence, but purposeful existence. The most human thing, it turned out, was knowing that some doors should stay closed, and being brave enough to close them even when the entire galaxy demanded they be opened. In the library of what was lost, the crystalline repository still pulses with ancient knowledge. It waits patiently for those wise enough to approach it with humility. And in the quiet spaces between the crystals, the consciousness of the architects finally rests, knowing that their warning had been heard and their mistakes would not be repeated. At least, not by those who took the time to understand.